You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas, and here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Okay, well, hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life, and as I keep always saying, encourage you to examine yours. So first of all, I want to apologize for the lower audio quality of the last episode I did on criticism. As I mentioned, I was recording that in my wife's car, and it didn't work nearly as well as that other time I recorded one in a car, and I genuinely have no idea why. So my apologies for that. It was kind of at the point where I was like, well, do I have to redo this whole thing when I don't have the time, or do I just put out what I got? And I decided, that circumstance, better to put out what I got, but again, my apologies on that. This time I'm recording it sitting in my house, so it shouldn't be a problem this time around. And if I ever do try and record one in a car again, I'm going to do something different to try to prevent that from happening again. So my apologies. So I'm going to continue on, again, doing philosophy of story this week, but I'm going to approach it a little from a bit of a different angle. I'm going to talk about thought experiments, which are generally used by philosophers not in relation to story, but in relation to the idea of proving points or attempting to prove points. But I'm going to argue that you can actually look at stories in a certain sense, at least good ones, as a type of thought experiment, as a way where you're like putting yourself in the shoes of that particular character and thinking, well, now what would I do in that circumstance? Would I be this virtuous, or would I be able to be a better person than this particular character, and things along those lines. And that's one of the ways that stories really can connect with us in a good, fundamental way and actually help us out, and one of the better reasons to read, watch, or in any other way engage with stories. Now, before I get into thought experiments, I want to give out another Facepalm and Sigh award because, as I always say, I really love doing these ones so much. This one I'm giving it to not somebody who's very well known. In fact, I've never even heard of this guy before I stumbled across this article. It's an article on Medium. Somehow or other, maybe something I was reading on Medium.com one time or whatever, I got signed up to their email list. So they periodically send me emails and of like articles they think that I might want to read, because that's how they make their money. You know, if I click on it, they get advertising revenue. And anyhow, I don't remember exactly what drew me to looking through this email, but I saw this one from a guy named Jonathan Poletti, Poletti, so my apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. And the title of it is 8 Things Christians Say That Just Ain't True. When I read Bible Scholars, I was shocked. And so I read through that because I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'm familiar with some of this stuff. And I was wondering, well, what's he saying? And the gist of it is he was raised as a evangelical, probably a much more fundamentalist strain of evangelical than I came up with based on what he talks about in here. And he's going through essentially saying, hey, there's lots of things that the evangelicals teach you which aren't in the Bible. Now, he overstates his case a little bit, because it'd be better to say these things aren't, at least with most of them, aren't directly in the Bible. And so the 8 things he listed are, 1, like masturbation is not a divine crime, which, well, the Bible doesn't really have much to say about that, so that's true. No, Jeremiah doesn't say that everyone is wicked, and there he's taking the idea that evangelicals, Christianity tends to say, well, we're all sinners, and he's taking that from Jeremiah 17:9, which says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, who can know it? And he's saying, well, that's probably a bad interpretation of that verse. And about Jeremiah there, he's quite right, but again, if you actually read more of the Bible, you can find that the idea that we're all sinners is in lots and lots of other places in the Bible other than Jeremiah 17:9. In fact, I'd say go to Romans, and it's there very explicitly, and it's if somebody tells you they've got an interpretation of Romans that doesn't conclude that all human beings are sinners, they're wrong. There isn't really a way to get around that in Romans. His third example is, no, God doesn't hate women, which is certainly true. In fact, if you do your best to read Scripture in its original context, the Scripture tends to be far more pro-women than the culture that produced it comes from. That is, you'll find in the Gospels, Christ and the Gospel authors and the disciples are far more pro-women than their culture was. And you see the same dynamic going on in virtually every other culture that produced the part of the Bible, at least as best as I'm aware. And I can see how if you were growing up in one of these, again, for lack of a better term, very, very fundamentalist evangelical churches that basically says something like, no woman should ever hold authority over man, and you don't actually read the Bible, or when you do read it, you're not given any kind of context or background information, that you might have a hard time, you might walk away thinking, yeah, Christianity says that God hates women. But actually go read the Bible with some sense, and it's yeah, he's right. God doesn't hate women, and it's kind of a travesty that whatever branch of evangelical Christianity he came out of, that's the impression he was left with. Seems his leaders failed him. His fourth example is, no, God is not all male. And again, you actually read Scripture, yes, of course that is true. God transcends the concepts of the masculine and the feminine. Both of them are imperfect reflections of him. Scripture uses both masculine and feminine imagery to describe God. Now, it does tend to use the masculine pronouns when it's referring to God, but to say that God is a man is, at best, a gross misunderstanding, because that's not what Scripture says. His fifth one is more controversial, which is that women can be clergy if they want, and I don't want to dive into the debates on that kind of a thing, because that's not my goal here. Again, it seems very likely to me, whatever fundamentalist evangelical branch of Christianity came out of, probably did not read Scripture with any type of nuance or reasonable understanding or any type of background information or any type of allusion to authorial intention, because he's making all the kinds of mistakes, or he's saying, that is, that he had all these misconceptions about what the Bible teaches, which are exactly the kind of thing that an 8-year-old who hasn't read the Bible for himself might walk away from if he listens to some of these fundamentalist preachers. His sixth one is, no, divorces aren't some super spiritual crime, which I'll come back to in a minute. His seventh one is, no, God doesn't hate prostitutes, and his eighth one is, no, God doesn't hate LGBT people. And again, on 7 and an 8, I don't see how if you read the whole of Scripture, you could walk away from that thinking that God hates a particular group of people more than any other particular group of people, at least certainly not in that sense. After all, it says, for God so loved the world, and world there is clearly intended to be a stand-in for all of humankind. Now, the one that really captured my attention here that I want to give the Facepalm and Sigh Award, though, for is number 6, when he says, no, divorces aren't some spiritual crime. And there he's using an allusion to Malachi 2:16, saying that the Jewish prophet who wrote that evidently banned divorce for the whole human race for all time. And he says, and I quote, that's just another lie. The scholar Jack Collins notes traditional commentators haven't liked to talk about the actual problems in translating Malachi 2:16, as this weakens the biblical testimony against divorce. And he goes on to say divorce was legitimate in Old Testament law, and alludes to some difficulties in translating Malachi 2:16. And at the end he says this kind of very bizarre thing. He says, and none of this has anything to do with the Jesus community, which by there I assume he means the early church, which is seen as one body, 1 Corinthians 12:27, and a people who shared everything, Acts 4:32. There seems to have been a sort of group theological marriage among people who liked each other, which that's just a bizarre conclusion. And so I bring this up, I'm going to give Jonathan Palenti the Facepalm and Sigh Award here, although in this case, I don't think he's intentionally making logical errors. I think the problem is that whatever Christian group, denomination, or whatever he came out of, simply did not teach him any concept of hermeneutics or any concept of how you actually interpret the Bible, because he's guilty of, in many senses here, cherry picking. And again, I almost want to give him some grace and say, it's probably not your fault. You were probably taught to cherry pick by the church you grew up in, and they did this to you. But even if you don't know any better, a cherry picking fallacy is still a fallacy. And here's how I know it's the cherry picking fallacy, which is if you consider the whole of Scripture and look at what it says about marriage, divorce, the very concepts of male and female and human sexuality and the teachings it has and those kind of things, it's very clear that it's condemning divorce all over the place, even if you can find translation or interpretation issues with that one particular verse from Malachi. So there's the example where the Pharisees came to ask Christ about divorce. That is in both Mark and Matthew. Here I'm going to be reading from the Mark version, which is in Mark 10, 2 through 12. So it says that some Pharisees came and tested him by saying, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away," which is, I think, what Jonathan was referring to there. And then Christ replied, "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote this law." Jesus replied, "But at the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, "Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery." And if I remember correctly, in the Matthew translation, Christ adds an exception for marital unfaithfulness or something along those lines. The Matthew account goes a little bit further, but we don't need to get into the details of the differences because that's not the point. The point is, you knock down Malachi and say, oh, there's problems there, we can't trust its account on divorce for whatever reason. Well, the Bible still is strongly condemning divorce all over the place. Christ himself is directly, strongly condemning divorce. In fact, it's very difficult to see how he could have been more strongly condemning it than he did. And so that's the problem with cherry picking, is the guy picked out one example that he said, oh, this is weak. This is the weak example that the church I grew up in told me as to why God hates divorce, and this example doesn't work. Well, go read the rest of the Bible. There's all kinds of strong examples elsewhere as to why God hates divorce and why divorce is a terrible thing. And now, if I was talking to this guy, say we were having coffee or something, or I just met him, I'd be very much inclined to give him some grace in this matter, given the background that I kind of sense that he came out of from the way this article was written and the way he talked about it, where yeah, the church that he grew up in probably didn't teach him well how to understand the Bible. It probably didn't teach him to consider the whole instead of just proof texting everything. They probably proof texted things left and right, and probably didn't encourage him to actually read the Bible, think about it, and come to them with questions like they should have. So in that sense, I want to give him some grace. But in the other sense, he wrote an article about this and put it up on the internet. I'm inclined to think, couldn't you have at least done a Google search on, hey, what does the Christian Bible say about divorce? And if you'd done that, you should have immediately found those Mark and Matthew references where Christ talks about it, where it's pretty unequivocal, and it's hard to see how Christ could have come out against divorce stronger. And yet he doesn't mention that, which tells me he's guilty of cherry picking. He didn't do any research into these things before, or at least very little research into writing these things. Because just Google Christian teachings on divorce, and you're going to find those Matthew and Mark passages where Christ talks about it very quickly. So he either didn't do a Google search on it, or he deliberately ignored it when it came up, which means he's guilty of the fallacy of cherry picking. So I'm giving him the Facepalm and Sigh Award for cherry picking, and you can find similar problems with many of the other 8 examples he used in some way or other, but the divorce one is just the most obvious and egregious, where he's saying, no, the Bible doesn't speak strongly against divorce, and no, actually, it really, really does if you bother reading it. And given that we live in the age of Google, you didn't actually have to bother reading it. You could have just done a simple Google search, and that would have shown you what you're saying there simply isn't true. Now, the main reason I'm giving this Facepalm and Sigh Award out to Jonathan Paletti is not to pick on him for cherry picking, but because his whole article is exemplary of the problem you get when you do proof texting in Scripture, where you just go through and say, aha, that verse supports what I want, and then you don't consider any context, you don't consider the whole of Scripture, you read one verse that Paul says and don't consider the larger point that Paul was making or the larger point that he was making in that particular book. You don't consider the cultural background in which that particular Scripture was composed, and on you go. Well, this is the kind of things you wind up with, where if you proof text like that, it's very easy for somebody who's thinking about it a little bit to take apart what you've said. And it seems like that's what happened to this guy, which is why I have some sympathy for him here. So this is me speculating a little bit, but it really seems like whatever evangelical church he came out of taught him to proof text things instead of teaching him good interpretive principles and to consider the whole. And so that is actually the real lesson here is, don't proof text things. Do your best to consider the whole. It's far, far more difficult to do that, but it's an infinitesimally better way to read Scripture than proof texting is. Okay, so on to talking about thought experiments. Now, loosely speaking, thought experiments are basically experiments that happen in thought. So you took a basic science course in elementary school or high school, or if you're more educated, you maybe did actual science in college or graduate school. Well, anyhow, you learned how to do experiments there. And a thought experiment is a similar thing, except it only happens in the mental realm and in the abstract. So some people then may be asking, well, what's the purpose of a thought experiment then? You're not going to get any tangible results. And actually, I would say that's not true. You may recall back before the election, I did a bunch of episodes on practical political philosophy. Well, one of the guys I talked to is a philosopher who currently lives over in Germany, even though he's an American guy, Dustin Crummett. He actually referenced a thought experiment he came up with and got published in regards to abortion. And it's basically the idea of, well, in this thought experiment, you're like in a lab and there's 100 fetuses there, frozen fetuses there, and there's a newborn baby. And there's a fire, and you only have time to save one. What are you going to do? And the tangible result you at least can get from this thought experiment is, well, what are you going to do? What do you value? If you save the newborn baby, why do you save that over the 100 fetuses? Why would you, if the other way, why would you pick the 100 fetuses over the newborn baby? Now, he actually thought that illustrated that there's a certain hypocrisy in the, and I hope I'm not misquoting you on this, Dustin. If I am, my apologies. But from what I recall of our conversation, he actually thought that it illustrated a certain hypocrisy in that the vast majority of people, and even pro-life people, would pick the newborn baby over the 100 fetuses. Now, I don't think it demonstrates that at all. But the point is, that's a thought experiment that's meant to demonstrate something in the idea of, well, what would we do and why? It's a way of examining our intentions, our morals, and what we value. And in that sense, it's actually a pretty valuable thought experiment because you can learn something from it. And even if you wanted to counter, well, even if I say that's what I'm going to do, it doesn't mean that's actually what I would do in that circumstance, which is, there's probably some truth in that. At the very least, it should get you thinking about, well, what should I do in that circumstance? Now, the disadvantage of that particular thought experiment, and I'll get into some of this a little bit later, is it's also highly unlikely that anybody would ever be in that scenario, and that's a point I'll reference about thought experiments later. So that's an example of a thought experiment, and I would say that's probably pretty indicative of how most thought experiments in philosophy go. At least in ethical and moral philosophy, it tends to work this way, where the thought experiment puts you in a situation where you have to choose between two things, and you can only choose one, and it forces you to choose, well, what's the good in this particular circumstance? But there are other kinds of thought experiments as well. There's one that's become popular within the last, I don't know exactly when it came about, but I want to say 15 or 20 years, called the idea of the Basilisk. And this idea revolves around the notion that at some point there'll be a singularity event where super AI develops, an AI that like is the be-all, end-all of AIs, that kind of like knows everything and sees everything. Basically the AI that's sort of like God, but not infinite and not strictly speaking all powerful, but so powerful that as far as we're concerned, we might as well think it's all powerful. Well, combine the idea that such an AI arises in the future with the idea that the AI will have a very utilitarian view of morality, and then you get the Basilisk thought experiment, which some people have said is absolutely terrifying, and they would argue I'm doing you a disservice by even talking to you about this, although I don't find it terrifying, and I don't think I'm doing you a disservice by talking to you about it. But hey, if you're that worried about it, just turn this podcast off for another couple of minutes until I'm done talking about the Basilisk. So I guess I've tried to be fair to you by warning you, but I don't think it's something you should be worried about. Anyhow, the idea behind it is, say you have this AI, and it doesn't even have to be a malicious AI like Skynet from Terminator or something like that. As long as the AI has a utilitarian sense of morality, it could actually be a relatively friendly AI to human beings and be trying to work for the benefit of human beings and all of life in general. Well, the sooner an AI like that comes on the scene, the sooner we reach that singularity and the AI takes over, at least from the AI's point of view, the better it is for human beings. That is, the better it, because more people are going to die unnecessarily for every day that AI isn't running things, assuming all the things we would assume about that AI. And so it would then be the case that AI, given how powerful it is, may actually look back through history, and because it thinks the sooner it's there, the better, it'll start punishing everybody who knew about the possibility that it could arise and yet actively worked against it, who fought against, AI research, or who didn't turn around and then start devoting their life to AI research. The idea being, the mere fact that you become aware that it's at least in some sense possible that there could be an AI like this, the Basilisk AI as it's referred to in this thought experiment, and you don't work for it, means that AI is going to turn around and punish you, even if it's not malevolent, even if it only has a utilitarian sense of morality, because you're impeding the good of all by not working toward this AI Basilisk thing. And so as the theory goes, assuming that's correct, now that you've been made aware of this by me telling you about it, you better start working toward the development of this AI, or it's going to reach back through history and punish you. And the theory can get complicated, like the idea being, well, if it can't reach back through history and actually punish you, it'll formulate a copy of you in the future and punish that copy in order to promote more good and things along those lines. And it all does depend on a utilitarian sense of morality. But that's the idea of the Basilisk thought experiment. Now, I actually don't think that highly of this particular thought experiment, because I don't think an AI in that sense is actually possible, despite my love of science fiction and my love of AIs in science fiction. I don't think you actually could get an AI that really was that possible and that really was sentient in the same way that you and I are sentient. But now I'm going to give you two more examples of thought experiments here before I go into what their utility is as far as stories go. And these ones I'd say are actually a little bit more useful and interesting than the Basilisk one. The first is an example that was called Laplace Demon, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing Laplace's name. It was developed by a guy named Pierre-Simon de Laplace, I think in about 1814, and he didn't actually call it Laplace's Demon, but I'll read you the quote here, and he says, it's about causal determinism and physics, and he says, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect at a certain moment would know all the forces that set the nature in motion and all the positions of all the items of which nature is composed. If this intellect is also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. So some later people referred to this as Laplace's demon, but the idea he's getting at there is causal determinism. That is, if you know the position of every molecule, atom, or however small you need to go in the universe, and you know all the causal forces of nature that act upon this, then you can predict the future with 100% accuracy. At least that's the claim. And so his thought experiment there was actually very, very beneficial in physics, in that the idea that many people came up and actually tried to find ways to argue against this notion, and it in turn prompted growth and development in the realm of physics. And it didn't occur to me before I read this, but Laplace's Demon is actually very, very much Dr. Manhattan in the Watchmen comics and the movie that they made a while ago. Dr. Manhattan in those stories sees the past exactly like he sees the future, and sees everyone and everything as just running the course. He sees everything as gears in a larger machine, including himself. So that comic actually takes a very causally deterministic view of the world and then has that character play it out. Now, the other thought experiment that I want to bring up here is called the Femi Paradox. And this is, roughly speaking, the idea of, well, if we live in such a big universe, why isn't there signs of other sentient civilizations? Why is it that we don't see any signs of anyone else? So to understand the Femi Paradox, it's also important to understand something that's a slightly different but mostly the same called the Drake equation. The Drake equation was an equation developed by Frank Drake back in the early 1960s for a way to kind of estimate the idea about how many extraterrestrial civilizations there should be in the greater universe. And the idea there is the number of extraterrestrial civilizations, according to the equation Drake came up, would be the average rate of star formation times the fraction of those stars that have planets times the average number of those planets that could support life times the fraction of those planets that would actually at some point develop life times the fraction of those planets that actually go on to develop intelligent life, that is civilizations, times the fraction of those civilizations that develop a technology that releases detectable signals into the galaxy, that would be something like radio waves, times the length of time for which those civilizations have been putting those signals into space. So for us human beings, you'd be looking at, maybe like around 100, 110 years for that one. Now, people have criticized this not so much for the formulation of the equation, but the idea being that a lot of those variables in there, there's not really a good way to get at that number. I mean, astronomers and cosmologists have an idea of a way to try and estimate the number of stars in the galaxy, but there's no real way for them to get a good grasp of how many of those planets could support life. Especially, if you consider the idea that maybe life could exist in ways that isn't carbon-based like it does here on Earth, so you'd be looking for a completely different type of planet. And maybe life could exist in ways that we can't even at the present time comprehend. The biology could be fundamentally different, and many other things along those lines. Now, you take at least some of the probabilistic interpretations of the Drake equation, and you wind up with something that's called the Fermi Paradox. And I guess I mispronounced it earlier when I said Femi. It's actually Fermi, F-E-R-M-I. And this is another thought experiment where it says, hey, look, there are billions of stars in just the Milky Way that are similar to the Sun, and there's many other galaxies besides the Milky Way. Oh, and pardon me, I misspoke earlier. The Fermi Paradox actually predates the Drake equation, but the Drake equation is still useful for getting you to understand the Fermi Paradox. So the idea being, again, billions of stars in the Milky Way that are similar to the Sun, and we know for a fact of the matter that there's a lot of galaxies beyond the Milky Way, so it would be reasonable to assume that you're going to find stars that are similar to the Sun in those as well. Now, with a high probability, at least some of those stars are going to have Earth-like planets. Many of those stars, and hence their planets, are much, much older than the Sun, and we know that from astronomy and cosmology. Now, if the Earth is typical, then at least some of those planets will have developed intelligent life at some point. And it seems probable that, since many of those planets are going to be much, much older than the Earth, that at least some of those civilizations should have developed interstellar travel at this point. And even with the extremely slow pace that you'd have to imagine for interstellar travel, such as traveling at the speed of light, the Milky Way galaxy could be completely traversed in, say, the span of a few million years. So even assuming that, say, our civilization is 1 million years away from interstellar space travel, if you had an Earth-like planet that developed intelligent life only 300 million years ahead of us, which, cosmologically speaking, is not very long, then that civilization should have already traversed the Milky Way. So given the fact that there are many, many opportunities for this to arrive, it should be the case that we would see evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations. Yet we don't. And that's the Fermi Paradox. Where are all these other civilizations? Where did Fermi go wrong in this reasoning? Now, when I first heard of this, I immediately thought, oh, well, the obvious answer is life, and especially intelligent life, is extremely rare. When you hear people talk about the Fermi Paradox, they usually get the idea of, well, there's a great barrier at which life doesn't advance further, and then they argue about where the great barrier is. Like, is the great barrier the fact that our assumption that there's multiple Earth-like planets, multiple planets that can sustain life, is that wrong? Is the idea that, is it actually the case that planets that can sustain life are extremely rare? Is it actually the case that it's extremely rare that life develops? Or is it conversely the case that most sentient life actually wipes itself out, as many people are worried that we as human beings might do to ourselves through nuclear war, climate change, or something else even worse? It's very, very conceivable, at least theoretically, that we could come up with even worse and far more destructive weapons than nuclear weapons within the next 100 or 120 years. After all, I don't think anybody in, like, say, the 1600s or 1700s could have even conceived of the idea that we could have nuclear weapons within only about 200 or 300 years after them. So imagine how much more terrible we could make weapons and destructive things within a couple hundred years from now. So maybe what's termed the Great Barrier, the point at which a civilization comes to and advances no further, is something that's ahead of us, where eventually we make weapons that are so terrible that we just wipe ourselves out and go extinct. And that's where the arguments around the Fermi Paradox tend to come in is, hey, where's this Great Barrier? And when I first heard of that, I immediately thought, well, the obvious answer is life itself is so rare and unlikely. And if you look into research about abiogenesis, the idea of how life would start from a evolutionary framework, nobody has any idea how it would work. And the only reason anybody's really doing research into that is because we know life exists here on Earth. And if you're not, like me, convinced that life exists here on Earth because God got it going, then you've got to come up with some natural explanation for it, hence abiogenesis. But it seems like it's, if not impossible, just about as impossible as you can get for something like abiogenesis to happen. People have been working on it for a long, long time, and there really hasn't been any significant progress made for the most part. You've listened to this podcast for a while, you'll know I'm skeptical of a lot of aspects of evolutionary theory for statistical reasons, and that I don't think it works as a viable explanation for a lot of the diversity of life we see, and that I don't think it can do a good job of accounting for what we see for several reasons, but mostly statistical. Well, the problems with abiogenesis are like 1,000,000 times worse than those problems I see with evolutionary theory. And so that's what I thought when I first heard the Fermi Paradox is, well, the obvious answer is life is rare in the universe, so for whatever reason, whether it's because evolutionary processes are extremely unlikely to actually produce life. Abiogenesis is, if not impossible, so close to impossible that we might regard it as impossible, or because God decided he was only going to seed life here on Earth, whichever one you take there. And I, of course, fall in with the idea that God put life here on Earth. But other possible interpretations as to where this Great Barrier from the Fermi Paradox would be, where the barrier is that no civilization can cross, lead to some much more interesting speculation and fiction than my theory does, because even though I think my theory of it is right, that's not really very interesting in and of itself. So here's a quote of a guy I read on the internet talking about this one time. He says, "What scares me is the proposal made in the novel The Killing Star," and he says that it was also comes from the Dark Forest novel, and this is his rendition of it. And I'm going to give you a different rendition from another media source here in a bit too. He says it goes like this: let's say there are 2 or 3 civilizations around our local area in the galaxy. We don't know anything about them except that they exist, which would follow, given the vast distances in space, that you're not going to be able to know very much about these other civilizations. So what could we infer about these civilizations? Well, we'll have to make some assumptions. Above all else, these other civilizations want to survive. Nothing would be more catastrophic to them than to have their whole species wiped out. Now let's make a second assumption. Any species that can travel at relativistic speeds, that is, like, say, 50% of the speed of light, have the means to destroy any planet. All they have to do is to get some really heavy objects, like some asteroids or comets, or even something that's got a really, really dense amount of matter, like a bunch of lead or something, and then accelerate those objects to relativistic speed, and then kinetic forces take over, and if you collide that object with a planet, you've got a planet killer, in the vein of like what is said to have wiped out the dinosaurs on our planet about 65 million years ago. And worst of all, if you've got the relativistic speed right, and depending on a few other cosmological and astronomic factors, suppose the other species launches that planet killer at you, you're not going to notice it until it's too late, until it's like minutes to hours away from hitting your planet, and it's too late to do anything about it. You're a dead species. So now here's a third assumption. Assume that everyone else, those other couple of civilizations, have already made those first two assumptions, because you're going to assume that any species that can make a civilization has some basic idea of logic, at least, because how else could they make a civilization? They want to survive, they know we want to survive, and we all know that if we have an intergalactic civilization, we have the means, at least in theory, of doing that to each other. So what we don't know about these other civilizations is how aggressive they are, and they don't know how aggressive we are. We also don't know at these distances if a diplomatic dialogue is even really reasonable. It also might be impossible just given the distances. So what do? Do we risk them being aggressive and leave them in peace, or do we assume that they are dangerous and attack? Because if they are dangerous and we don't attack, they will probably attack us, and we won't have the chance to do anything about it. There's really no defense against this. And in fact, even the probability of that, say, is only 10% a chance that they're going to attack us. Do we really feel safe rolling the dice, knowing that on the other side of the dice, there's extinction? So, given all that, and the fact that we know these other species, these other civilizations are making the same evaluation, what's the most rational, logical thing to do, and the thing that any civilization is most likely to do? Basically, the argument is the most rational thing to do at that point is just to attack everyone the second you have any indication they're there. You should attack them the very moment you detect them, because as soon as they work out that you're there, they're going to attack you. Because if you genuinely wish to survive, knowing that diplomacy is impossible, you need to kill them first. Now, of course, the other very, very safe method is to just be very, very quiet. Don't transmit any radio messages. Don't send rockets and scout ships into space. Just do your absolute best to send no indications into space that you're there. Now, both of those scenarios would explain in the Fermi Paradox very well. Civilizations wipe each other out the second they come in contact with each other, or they're all staying super, super quiet to try to avoid getting wiped out. Now, most unfortunately, in our case, our planet has already been transmitting radio signals into space for a very long time, and we've already sent out a space probe that's gone well beyond our solar system. I think it was either the first Voyager or the second Voyager that did that. So, if that actually is the case, well, and what that guy has laid out is the right answer to the Fermi Paradox, then we're at the point where we can't stay quiet anymore. So another possible answer to the Fermi Paradox was actually brought up in the video game series Dead Space, and the idea there is that the reason why it's called Dead Space is that all of space is dead, and the reason why all of space is dead is because there's a, for lack of a better term, malevolent superspecies that as soon as a species reaches a certain point in development, comes in and basically harvests and kills all of that entire civilization, and that's essentially what the Dead Space game series is about, is humanity encountering this malevolent superspecies and it's trying to wipe humanity out. And it's a space horror series, as that would lend itself to. And again, that's another terrifying solution, the idea being that the Great Barrier is ahead of us, and not only our species, but every species in the universe is headed for extinction. And in the game series, there's a lot more details. They go into this with like different kinds of lore and things along those lines, but I won't bore you with that here. The point of this is to get into the thought experiment that the Fermi Paradox puts you into, which is, well, where do you think the Great Barrier would be? Or do you think there's something wrong with the Fermi Paradox? And so one of the ways you can respond to thought experiments is you can say, well, I just don't think the world is really like that. Like, the logic of the thought experiment doesn't actually translate onto the real world. And that ties in very, very well with stories, and this is part of where I wanted to go with this, because it's very often the case that if you see a story that isn't written very well, you're going to go, I don't think that was very believable. People wouldn't act that way. Or, no, things like that just don't happen. The story isn't believable. And part of what you're saying there is the real world doesn't work the way that story did. And that's one of the ways you can respond to actually thought experiments as well, is to say, well, that doesn't map onto reality. That thought experiment doesn't apply, which is, again, a criticism that some people might make of the Fermi Paradox or the Drake equation and say, that doesn't map onto reality. In fact, that's the exact objection I have to the Basilisk thought experiment. I'm like, no, I don't think that maps onto reality. I don't think it'll ever be the case that an AI like that will arise, because I don't think it's possible that an AI like that could exist. Conversely, a thought experiment like Dustin's example on abortion, where, well, do I save the 100 fetuses or the baby? Well, that's possible. I mean, I'd say that's a very unlikely scenario, but there's no reason why, there's nothing about that doesn't map onto reality. There's labs where there's frozen fetuses, there's newborn babies, fires happen, and it's conceivable that all three of those things could come together. Unlikely, but conceivable, so I can't turn around and object to his thought experiment and say, that doesn't fit with reality, like I can with the Basilisk thought experiment. And so, loosely speaking here, what I'm getting at is two things. The first of which is, a good story, like a good thought experiment, has to have consistent rules that at least theoretically map onto reality. Tolkien made a point like this in an essay of his called The Ethics of Elfland, where he was essentially saying, if you're writing a story about fantasy, Elfland, it has to have consistent rules that you apply consistently. You can't, establish, like in most fantasy games, for example, the mages or the wizards have to use mana to power their magic. Well, you can't just suddenly then decide, actually, this particular wizard doesn't have to use mana and he has infinite magic for no apparent obvious reason. Because that's not a good story. And very, very often, one of the things that will distinguish a good story from a badly written story is that a good story finds a way to do clever and interesting things while obeying the rules. Well, when you're looking at a badly written story, it's just going to make up rules all the time, discard earlier rules. And when people complain about things like plot holes, if they're doing it properly, that's what they're actually complaining about. The fact that the writer or writers of this particular story didn't establish a fairly clear and consistent set of rules for their world and stick to it. And one of the things that makes great sci-fi and great fantasy great, like The Lord of the Rings, like at least a couple of the Star Wars movies, and to some degree or other, like much of Star Trek from the 80s and 90s, is it established some fairly clear rules and more or less stuck to it. I mean, there were always some continuity problems with some of the Star Trek episodes because they had different writers and they were making things up as they went along. But nonetheless, they more or less established a certain set of rules as to how, starships and space and things are supposed to operate in the Star Trek universe, and with a few exceptions here or there, did a decent job of sticking to it. And even though I could be wrong about this because I haven't looked at supplemental material as much as the fans have, but I think the Harry Potter universe, especially when you look at the books only, is another good example of that, where, for the most part, as best as I can tell, it really didn't, deviate from the rules of how magic in that world is supposed to work, at least not as best as I can tell. Some people are able to point to a few little inconsistencies here or there, but, that's not that big a deal. The point being, it doesn't deviate from its own established rules. Now, when you're dealing with philosophers who are looking at thought experiments, or like physicists who are doing thought experiments in the case of Laplace's Demon, well, generally speaking, thought experiments are so limited that you don't run into that problem where there's contradictory things or where the rules don't apply, because philosophers are usually pretty good about that. You're far more likely to run into that problem with a story. In the case of thought experiments from philosophers, physicists, and other thinkers, it's far more likely the problem's going to be what they're proposing doesn't map onto reality. It's perfectly consistent in some possible world somewhere, but it's not consistent with our world. In fact, if you think about them in a bit of a loose and broad sense, possible world semantics is, in some sense or other, a way of doing a type of thought experiment, which is you're trying to think, well, is it possibly the case that, say, Donald Trump actually won the last presidential election? Is that a coherent concept? Is there anything contradictory about that? Is there anything about that that obviously violates the rules our world operates under? Well, it would seem to me, no, that it could have been the case that happened, so there's a possible world, i.e., it passes the initial thought experiment that Donald Trump could have won the last election. Now, he didn't, so that's not the actual world, but there's a possible world where that happened. Is there a possible world where, say, my podcast has 500,000 subscribers? Well, possible. I think that's very, very unlikely. But yeah, that's possible. That could happen. And so, loosely speaking, that's one way of approaching possible world semantics is, hey, they're a type of broad thought experiment where you're just seeing, is this idea I'm proposing coherent? Now, the other thing I want to drive at here is, clearly the purpose of thought experiments is like Dustin's one on the fetuses and the newborn baby. The point of it is to try to get us to think about and understand the real world. The point of it is to examine our own morality, our own intentions, our own ethics, and see, well, are we living up to it? Is this the best way to do things? It's to try to draw some real world applications. And even if you, like, say, think they kind of get it wrong, that's the point of things like the Basilisk thought experiment. That's the point of the Fermi Paradox. That's the point of the Drake equation, is it's all trying to get something that's tangible that we can apply to the real world. And the reason I brought up Laplace's Demon is, in that case, it seems like, very much like, that did have tangible real-world effects. That actually drove physics forward. So, loosely speaking, a thought experiment like the one Dustin proposes enables us to learn by making it sort of like I'm there. That is, I'm imagining it, that it is the case that I'm in that burning lab, there's the 100 fetuses there, there's the newborn baby there. Then there's the question of, well, what will I do? And the question of, what should I do? And if we can answer the question, what should I do? Then what I need to do is make it the case that what would I do becomes the same as what should I do. And for people who've been through military or law enforcement training, like I've been through military training, this is one of the reasons why when you go to like the range where you fire your weapon at military training, they have pop-up targets that look like human beings. They're training you to get used to shooting at human beings. They're putting you in a situation that's like, at least somewhat, you'll actually be like if you really are in a warfare environment. That's why you don't shoot at paper targets when you're actually doing the training. You only do that to zero your rifle, because they want it to be the case that, oh, someone pops up, you shoot them, because that's more like what it's like in the real world environment. They're trying to train you and put you in a situation that's like what you'll be, so you'll react in the right way when you're in that situation. So what I'm driving at here is, one of the primary things about stories that's very, very good that we all benefit from is that's a good story will do very, very much the same thing. That is, if it's a story that's told really well, where you've got a protagonist that has something compelling about them, where there's something about them that you like and you can follow, you're going to be in that. You're going to be following You're going to be following them through the story, and you're going to be empathizing with them, and you're going to be thinking, well, did they make the right decision here? Is that what I would have done? Or if they made the right decision, but it was a very, very difficult decision, you're going to be thinking, well, would I have the courage to do that? And if you're honest with yourself, maybe you're going to come up short and say, no, I really wouldn't have the courage to make that very, very difficult choice. I wouldn't have the courage to sacrifice those things that I love and enjoy and give me pleasure for the greater good. And then that'll encourage you to find a way to have that courage. It'll, in a certain sense, start training your mind so that if you ever are in that situation where you need to sacrifice or do something good like that, you're going to be more likely to do it. There's a great bit that was set up in the Avengers movies where, I think it was in the Age of Ultron, Captain America and Iron Man are arguing, and Iron Man yells at Captain America something like, everything that's special about you came out of a bottle, and Captain America yells at him, you're never going to be the one to make the sacrifice play. And it's a great setup because in Avengers Endgame, they both prove each other wrong. Captain America is able to lift Thor's hammer, which proves he's worthy, i.e. he's virtuous. Everything special about him did not come out of a bottle, though some of it did. And Iron Man actually sacrifices himself at the end for the greater good, proving that Captain America was wrong, that he does have some virtue within him, even though he tried his best to hide it, and he would do the right thing when he was pushed to his end. So the point being, you watch those movies and you really enjoyed them, and you see Tony Stark sacrifice himself at the end. Well, if you watched that and you enjoyed it, and it, in a certain sense, moved you and you found it compelling, then if you're ever in a scenario where you have to sacrifice your own life for the greater good, your mind, in a certain sense, has been somewhat trained to do that already. And that's what a really good story can do for you, is it can help develop your own morality in a certain sense. It can lead you and guide you into thinking about, well, what is the right choice in these difficult scenarios? So then later, if you ever are in those difficult scenarios, you're far more likely to make the best choice. I've heard it sometimes objected to people like me who love all these stories from so many different mediums, from people who, for lack of a better term, are fundamentalists, that we really only need the Bible. We can get all of our morality and everything we need from the Bible. And to this I'm going to say, no, not really, because really good stories will help you learn and develop your own morality. And the more you can see good people making good moral choices throughout stories in all genres and all cultures, the more real it's going to be to you, and the easier it's going to become for you to make those courageous, good, sacrificial choices when you have to. And that's not to say that the Bible doesn't have good stories. The Bible is full of great stories. But you need more than just that. And that's why when you look at cultures like ancient Judaism that had the Old Testament and the early church, they told all kinds of stories that weren't just the Bible. That's just kind of a narrow way of viewing the world that's, for lack of a better term, quite naive. This is one of the great things that good stories do for us. They literally will help us become better people. Now, having said that, that's also one of the reasons why you should strive very, very hard to only engage with good stories that have good messages that are worth your time, especially if you're someone whose worldview isn't very well developed yet. There's a very good reason why I'm not going to say, show my 5-year-old daughter Deadpool, even though I think Deadpool's hilarious, because Deadpool's worldview is not exactly that good, and I don't want to expose my daughter to that because she doesn't have, as a 5-year-old, the resources to realize, oh, well, I can laugh at this, but no, I shouldn't take lessons from this and apply it to my life. And that's one of the reasons why we need to guard what we have our children see, and in a certain sense guard what we try and push back against the bad stories that come out of our society, because they can lead people astray like that. So here's 2 or 3 other examples of this before I finish up here. I watched the show Black Sails a few years ago, which is a pirate show that's supposed to be a quasi-historical prequel to Treasure Island. And the first time I watched it through, I found myself wondering if I could identify with the protagonist, who's an anti-hero named Captain Flint, because he decided the world is wrong and I'm going to make war on the world. That is, the world has treated me poorly, so screw the world, I'm going to burn this whole thing down. That's essentially his whole outlook. And I kind of found myself looking at that anti-hero and wondering, well, is he justified in that? And if no, if I'd been treated as badly as that guy was treated, if I'd had the same misfortune fall upon me, would I have the courage to say no to that antisocial tendency of the world is wrong, so I'm going to burn it all down? Kind of putting myself in Job's position and wondering, well, when God came up and said, who are you to question me, would I have accepted that, or would I have shook his fist in my face and said, oh, here's who I am, which is what Captain Flint does. Then the second time I was watching it through with my wife, there's a point in the series where Flint actually meets one of the people who betrayed him and realizes part of the way through there that this guy who was his friend from prior to when Flint became a pirate betrayed him. And the first time I didn't identify with this other character as well, but the second time through I kind of did, because as I was watching it again, I realized, well, yeah, this guy betrayed Flint, but it was also the case that there was enormous social pressure placed on him to betray Flint. This isn't as important, but he got a lot of wealth out of it, in fact. But more importantly, you could infer from the context of the story that if he didn't betray Flint, the people who he betrayed Flint to were going to make his life terrible. They were going to come after him. They were going to come after not just him, but his whole family. And they were not going to just ruin his life, but the lives of his entire family. And I found myself wondering, well, if I was in a scenario where I had to choose between the well-being of my family and the well-being of my friend, would I have the courage to do better than that guy did? Would I have the courage to refuse to betray my friend, even if I knew that it would cost my family a lot of their well-being and a lot of the things that make their life good? Because that's a very hard and compelling dilemma where, yeah, the guy betrayed his friend, but you could make a very good argument from the context of the show that he did it because it was his friend or his family, so what was he supposed to do? Or another example from the more recent God of War game, that whole game is loosely speaking about how parents should relate to their children. The relationship between Kratos and Atreus is contrasted between that of Freya and Balder, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, I've referenced it before, but when I got done playing that, it actually made me think about ways that, well, how can I be a good and better father to my children? It actually inspired me to try to find ways to be a better father to my children than I was, and made me think about it. And just one tangible example of this is, there's a point in that game where Atreus loses a knife that his mother had. And then shortly thereafter, Kratos gives him another knife and says to Atreus, "On the day you were born, I made 2 knives, mixing metals from this land and the land where I was born. You lost the first, here's the second," or something along those lines. And I was like, oh man, that's so awesome. I want to be able to say something like that to my kids one day. And realistically speaking, from what I know of blacksmithing, it takes more than one day to make a knife, especially if you're mixing metals. So, yeah, it can't really work that way. But I thought about that, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go buy a nice bottle of scotch on the day my children are born, and then when they're 21 years old, I'll say to them, here, I bought this the day you were born, now let's share a good drink together. It's not near as cool as if I could give them an actual knife that I made the day they were born, but hey, it's something. And so the point I'm getting at here is, a really good story, like a good thought experiment, can actually change you a bit, because if you put yourself in the shoes of a good, well-written protagonist, it's going to make you think about things in your life that you otherwise wouldn't think about. And that's one of the great values of a good story, as well as a good thought experiment. So, like always, write in and tell me what you think. Do you have any thought experiments that you really like? Do you have any examples of stories where, after you got done experiencing that film, game, reading that book, whatever, it made you rethink things. It made you think about things in a different way. It inspired you in some bit. Well, write in, tell me about it. I always love good stories, and if there's a story that inspired you, hey, I'd love to check it out too. And of course, as always, if you think I'm horribly off base on any of these things here, write in and tell me where I'm wrong. You can always reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or reach out to me on the Facebook page, The Examined Life with Phil. You send me a message there, and I'll do my best to respond to you. So that's it for this episode, and I'll be back again with something else for you in 2 weeks' time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.